Good evening. Thank you all. We're going to let our friends join us. Thank you all for being here. I'm Andrew Schwartz here at CSIS with External Relations, and I'm honored to have you all here with us tonight. We were going to wait until October to do this, but Jay broke a few stories, so we had to push it up. So I want you all to consider this part one. This is like a mini-series, okay? Because we're going to have part two on October 6th, and you're going to have a much better person to introduce Jay than me. It'll be Bob Schieffer. And some of you know I host a podcast with Bob called About the News. It's on iTunes. It's on CSIS website. But we have a partnership with Bob Schieffer and the Schieffer School of Journalism at TCU, and so we're going to have our first Schieffer series of the year around Jay's book. And so Bob will be interviewing Jay for that, and I hope all of you can come. And if you bought a book tonight, just think of it in October. You can buy another book. It's just in time for the holidays. You can sell. I mean, this is a great Christmas gift. Who doesn't want to read about Iran and war, around the holidays? So. But seriously, this is one of this is a true piece of journalism, in that it does exactly what a journalist is supposed to do: report the facts. And some of you here are Jay's colleagues at the Wall Street Journal and know what kind of reporter he is. I've worked with Jay for over 11 years now, and he's not even yelled at me once, which is good. He's always been fair to everybody he reports on, and I think this book, if you read through it, there's a lot of stuff in this book, and it's all fair. People say about journalism, well, you're supposed to be objective. Nobody is objective about anything, but if you're a journalist, you need to be fair, and I think that's what this book does, and I think that's probably the best thing you can say about any book. I sincerely hope that the Journal nominates Jay for a Pulitzer Prize, because this book and his reporting deserves it. I remember the first day the story came out about the negotiations and money, which Jay will talk about in a couple minutes. But Bob Schieffer and I were doing a podcast that day, and Bob looked at me. He says, "Can you believe this story?" Bob's been reporting on stuff for over 50 years, and when Bob Schieffer says, "Can you believe this?" I know it's a big story, and we knew it was a big story, and I would bet you that given the length of time CNN covers things like plane crashes and Donald Trump, if Donald Trump were not a candidate, we'd still be talking about this story every single night on the news on CNN. It's that big of a story. But without further ado, I want to introduce and bring up Jay Solomon, who's really one of the best reporters I know anywhere, and we're very fortunate to have him here at CSIS tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I want to acknowledge my boss. I know he's somewhere around here. Jerry, there he is. It's his fault. I just wanted to sort of start by just kind of giving kind of the background on how this book came about, and then take your questions, because it really was kind of the fruit of basically a decade of work, even though I really kind of only got into the heavy writing maybe for the past 2 years. For me, what was really interesting is not long after I moved back from Asia to the Washington Bureau, I did not really have any Middle East experience. This was back in 2006 when the war in Lebanon broke out, and they sent me off to Beirut. And I had covered conflict in Indonesia when Suharto was overthrown and the East Timor violence. So I'd seen conflict before, but the Lebanon thing really opened my eyes, because just the level of violence, not just the Israeli-Hezbollah war, but what was going on inside Lebanon at the time, whether it was the assassination of then Prime Minister Hariri or the continued sort of assassination campaign against anti-Syrian activist. I started to hear about it during the war, and I can remember that getting told from some of Hariri's people who were on the hit list. And I thought this was conspiracy. I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe anything would be that kind of in your face. And I came back kind of over the next few years a couple times, and virtually everyone who they said was on this hit list, most of them were taken out. And it was at that point, covering the war in Lebanon really sort of brought home to me, wow, the Iranian influence, it was really a regional conflict. I mean, it was Israel versus Hezbollah, but in Lebanon, it was the person not in the room or who everyone was talking about was what the Iranians were doing and who was kind of moving against Hariri's people, whether it was the Syrians, Hezbollah, or Iran. So that that experience in 2006 really kind of piqued my interest in this conflict that I could tell was kind of brewing between the U.S. and its allies on the one hand, and the Iranians and this axis of resistance, as it's called, which is Hezbollah, the Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthi militias in Yemen, the Assad regime. That's where it really kind of got into my head. And I think a big part of this book was kind of framing like this, really looking back at what's happened over the past 10 years. I mean, the book really starts from 9/11 and goes through today, and looking at the conflict in a lot of ways. The book was initially going to be called The Third War, because I knew everyone focused on the first war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, but kind of going on behind the scenes was very much this conflict between the U.S. and Iran and its various allies. One of the first chapters in the book is about Afghanistan, and I love talking to CIA guys who showed up in the Panjshir Valley just right after 9/11, and the IRGC was already there, and they're kind of standing off because both of them were trying to support the Northern Alliance. And in Afghanistan, there was cooperation with Iran. There's a lot of focus on the Obama administration and the engagement, but there was a lot more under Bush. And then one of the questions that I hope the book addresses, but I don't think I answered, was the calculations in the Bush administration when they went into Iraq, because there was a lot of concern inside the Bush administration about Iran at the time. The issue of its nuclear program was already kind of coming out. And I just, to this day, and I tried to answer, I still don't fully understand what the calculations were as far as going to Iraq, because some of the documents I used in the book were Saddam Hussein's intelligence files that were captured, and you can see his people as the U.S. is preparing to invade in 2003. They're almost more concerned about what the Iranians were going to do on their borders and activating their assets inside of Iraq as they were about the United States. And sort of the worst fears in a lot of ways that many Arab allies, even some Israeli allies, were talking about at the time, that the Iranians were essentially going to move and really consolidate a hold in Iraq, has pretty much come true. The other part of the book that really fascinated me as it moved from the Bush administration into the Obama administration was just how much of U.S. foreign policy throughout the Obama administration was just 100% fixated on Iran. Whether in the first, a lot of this stuff we only found out years later, but the president started sending these secret correspondence to the supreme leader of Iran just within months after taking power, and continued throughout the administration to send these missives to the supreme leader, and he would reply every once in a while. And policies from China to Russia in these initial years really were framed through Iran. Were the Chinese going to help the U.S. sanction Iran? Were they going to cut off oil sales to Iran? Were the Russians going to stop selling some of these strategic weapons to Iran? And what would be traded basically with the Russians in order to get their support? And one of the, I think, more controversial parts of the first Obama administration was that no one really planned, as Obama started to sort of line up engaging the Iranians, no one planned for this uprising, the Green Movement uprising in Iran in 2009. And I mean, the book argues basically that Obama did not, they really were reserved to in any way support them. The Green Movement, I think it was a very complicated call. I'm not sort of arguing it was clear. You had certain Iranian opposition groups from inside the country basically communicating to the U.S. that, you know, don't say anything publicly to support us. It's only going to brand us as lackeys by the regime. Others were saying they were going to do it anyways, and they did, and they cracked down. But that was a pretty pivotal moment, these 10 days where the uprising was really intense in Iran, and the U.S. and the White House really held back. And I think that's a window that I was in Iran recently, and you talk to activists, there's not much of a appetite there now for another kind of that type of uprising. So I think that window has pretty much closed. But as the second term moved into the first term moved into the second term, I think the way the diplomacy was established was pretty brilliant. The financial war, which is a big part of this book, I don't think anyone in the U.S. Treasury Department, the Israelis, the Saudi government, I don't think anyone thought that they could basically take the Iranian oil almost off the market in just a matter of 2 years, that they'd be able to freeze Iran out of the global financial system. And that, I mean, it was an amazing process to watch when this started basically back in 2007, 2008, as it started to get ratcheted up, because there was such skepticism that they could really cause as much pain, as much financial damage as they did. There's been a lot of focus, obviously, on the Stuxnet attack and how it sort of got out of control. Or I think the U.S. financial war was a kind of a financial cyber attack. It started and it just spread, and even when banks wanted to do business with Iran, they were so scared of getting on the wrong side of the U.S. This strategy of basically saying you either do business with Iran or you do business with us was incredibly successful, and it never had really been attempted before. So as you see in 2012, when the secret dialogue started with the Iranians in Oman, that it was at just that point that the financial pain was really starting. I mean, it's almost exactly, there's a corollary. Mid-2012 was when these first talks happened in Oman, and they didn't really go anywhere, but that's exactly when the worst part of the sanctions, which was the oil embargo and the Central Bank of Iran, and the sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran, and basically kicking them off this SWIFT financial system went into effect. And within that year, it really gained traction. Some of the more interesting reporting I did was just going to Iran in 2014 and talking to advisors of President Rouhani, and just describing when they took power from Ahmadinejad's government in 2013, they knew the financial situation in Iran was bad, but they basically looked at the books, and there was this huge black hole. I mean, they had a double combination of really bad financial management, like a black hole. One Rouhani advisor told me that the Ahmadinejad administration had something over $800 billion in oil revenues from the real high point in oil prices, which is from 2005 through about when they took over. Less than $300 billion of that was accounted for. So when they took power, there was this huge hole, and the only way they could plug it, basically, was to get this oil money that the international community, had frozen offshore, and to get the sanctions lifted. So you could see how well the diplomacy was established in 2012 going into 2013, and just how much impact the sanctions was having. I think in the book, it's maybe the more critical part is actually the execution of the negotiations once they really kind of exploded or really accelerated after Rouhani took power in 2013, because it wasn't just that the Iranians were facing this real financial turmoil. Their closest ally in Syria was under, incredible strain, 2012, 2013. And something I found extremely interesting was and no one knew about it when the famous debate over this red line that Obama set for the Syrian chemical weapons took place in 2013, in August of 2013. No one knew at the time that we were having these very high-level, intense negotiations with the Iranians in Oman. And this is still one of the most contentious issues on the whole Iran-Syria debate. The White House swears there was never any connection between what happened on our Syria policy and what happened on the Iran policy. But I interviewed Iranian officials who said if the U.S. had actually started hitting Assad, that the diplomats around Rouhani may have wanted to continue negotiations, but the Revolutionary Guard and the Khomeini, if they saw what was essentially an existential threat in Assad coming under attack, it would have been extremely difficult for them to continue negotiating. So was that the sole reason for the U.S. not going through with the red line? The administration says it wasn't related, but I think if you follow that through what's happened over the past few years on Syria, where in one letter we reported in the Wall Street Journal, President Obama writes the Supreme Leader Khamenei and says basically, we can cooperate with you fighting ISIS if we get this nuclear deal, but you should know we're starting these military targeting inside Syria, but the Assad regime is not our targeting. That the U.S. forced rebels that we were supporting basically to sign slips that would guarantee they weren't going to go to fight against the Syrian forces. So you could see as the nuclear talks were kind of starting in 2013, the U.S. was kind of assuring the Iranians on different levels into 2014 that their close ally was not going to be targeted. I spent a lot of time, as did many of my journalistic colleagues, in tough spots like Vienna and Lausanne and Geneva over the last year and a half. And the diplomacy was, as a story, was both really slow and plodding on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was incredible to sort of be so close to Iranian officials. If you're in Tehran, it's very difficult to even get these types of meetings with Foreign Minister Zarif or other senior Iranian officials as you could in walking down the street in Vienna or in Lausanne. But I think the book does raise serious questions about the tactics once the negotiations started, and the U.S. really did seem to have so much leverage between the financial sanctions, the weakness of the Assad regime, and then the plunge of oil prices, which was essentially happening as the negotiations were taking part. I know the administration really did believe that, and I interviewed Secretary Kerry for the book, basically saying, we averted a war. If there was no deal, I am guaranteed there would be a war. And there were periods in the book that I describe where I do think the chances for escalation were pretty. I never believed the U.S. was going to attack Iran. I'm extremely skeptical. The Israelis were very close. I think where the danger was that you had the assassinations of Iranian scientists that the Iranians blamed on the Israelis. You had terrorist plots that were linked back to the Revolutionary Guards everywhere from Bulgaria, where Israeli tourists were killed, to New Delhi, Mombasa in Kenya, Bangkok, Thailand, to Georgetown and Cafe Milano. I mean, if this stuff escalated, you never knew, coupled with the sanctions. But my perception was we were not particularly close to a war, but the administration definitely seemed to believe that. And I remember as the negotiations started to pick up, you'd hear from U.S. officials was saying, well, the military option's on the table, but if we ever attacked, it would guarantee they get a nuclear weapon. That was one message they would make. So you was thinking, okay, well, then the military option is basically off the table. And they would start talking down the sanctions. Like, it's not sustainable. The Europeans, the Asians are not going to stay on board. So you kind of got this feeling like, well, this is the window, and this is the window now. And one of the tactics in the book that I think people were quite critical of was knowing how the Iranians were watching the debate in Washington. This was in late 2013 as the interim agreement was just being completed. There was this push in Congress to get sanctions passed that would basically go into effect in a year after the interim agreement if there was no final deal. It was conditioned. They gave them a year for talks, and even then the White House had all sorts of flyers they could use to basically extend the talks if they thought. But the White House basically vetoed these talks under the belief that, well, the Iranians would have walked if we had sort of set up sanctions. From what I saw in Tehran, the last thing was the Iranians were going to walk. They saw the continuation of the sanctions as an existential threat. But I think by taking these steps, whether it was starting to relieve the financial sanctions, whether it was basically not pressuring Assad, whether it was talking down continued sanctions, that I think the Iranians started to feel that, like, we have a lot of leverage here ourselves because the administration does not want a conflict. And that to me was, as the talks continued, you could just see like a lot of red lines starting to move. First, it was no enrichment. I think most reporters who were covering it thought that was not sustainable, so maybe that would go. But then, the infrastructure in the secret site of Fordo, it will be capped, but they can keep it for a later date. And to watch how the Iranians use the good cop, bad cop kind of talking points, which the U.S. administration didn't want to. There was one really memorable exchange, and this was in July in 2014, where Zarif was meeting with Bill Burns, and the Supreme Leader gives a speech from Tehran saying, well, we actually need 100,000 centrifuges, and we're not going to cap any of that. And I think at the time, the administration was saying they could get them down to about 5,000 or 6,000. So at the time, it was like, wow, is this going to kill the process? The U.S. till this day will say, well, in the end we did get them down to 5,000. But I think if you really looked at what the Supreme Leader was saying, he's like, eventually we're going to have an industrial scale nuclear program of 100,000, and that in 10 years they can do that. So I think a lot of guidelines that he put to his negotiators, they followed it and kind of used this thing like, well, we know that this sounds crazy, but this is the guy in charge, and they played that game very, very effectively. And as the process really accelerated last summer in Vienna, it kind of had you felt like you were on a waterfall. This thing was definitely going to happen, and what to me was pretty amazing, just watching at the end, was these issues that they said were not part of the talks, whether it was missiles or conventional weapons. They kind of got thrown in at the last time, and suddenly they were, lifting the conventional arms embargo in 5 years, and lifting and watering down UN Security Council resolutions concerning their development of missiles, and lifting sanctions on people. I mean, one of the kind of worrying signs I remember is that there were a bunch of nuclear scientists that the administration for years and the IAEA had said were involved in secret weaponization work, and the Iranians would deny these guys even existed. They didn't live. And then suddenly we're combing through who was getting sanctions relief as part of this deal, and it's these guys who they said didn't exist. And then we were said, okay, well, if these guys are here, then surely the administration was going to force some of these scientists to cooperate with an IAEA probe, and none of that happened. I mean, I think one of the more worrying signs at the end was this for years there was this focus on the weaponization work that the Iranians had been doing, and they must sort of come clean because you need this baseline. And it really got kind of railroaded at the end, where it was like, well, they have to take these steps, but if they don't let them interview any of these scientists, it's okay. And if they don't get to go to certain sites, it's okay. We already know what they were doing. And I think people are pretty skeptical that the U.S. fully understood what they were doing. And to me, one of the more interesting things that happened since the deal was the IAEA finally did go into this one military site called Parchin, which was totally off grounds. And it was this kabuki dance with the Iranians where they would only take the samples themselves and give them to the IAEA. And the whole thing kind of happened quietly, and no one really paid any attention. But I remember the report finally came out, and if you kind of went down into the bottom of it, they actually did find uranium. And since that time, U.S. officials have told me that there was pretty much no other explanation for it, except for that was part of this weaponization work they had done in the early 2000s, but they kind of already knew everything, so it was basically being closed. And that, to me, is really one of the dangers kind of moving ahead. It is an arms control agreement in a lot of ways. That's how the White House had very much described it. But I think it's anyone who was close to the process really understood that on some level it was a bet on the politics, that if we can get this deal, we can create some sort of goodwill, that the supreme leader is not going to be around forever, and that maybe they're going to keep this infrastructure, but in 10 years, you're going to have a different political system, and we won't care as much of what they have. And the signs over the past, it is early days, so I really, in the book, I really try to acknowledge that. It's hard to sort of make any judgment now, but I just think if you look what's been happening over the past few months, whether it's missile tests, this week they kind of put these anti-ballistic missile batteries around one of the nuclear sites. They arrested one of the nuclear negotiators like over the weekend. The detainment of more Iranian Americans in the United States, more dual nationals. It's not a very optimistic, trajectory if your ultimate belief or hope is that this regime is going to moderate itself. And I do think, I think it's playing into the U.S. politics in a very interesting way, because I think the Iranians are kind of trying to set some very hard line going into whoever replaces Barack Obama. I think most people believe Hillary Clinton will have a bit of a different take. She's talked about being more aggressive in challenging Iran and sanctioning their entities. And Trump, it's hard to read. He first said he was going to scrap it. Now he's moderated it. But I think it's my hope is that there is some political moderation, and that the kind of the political calculation works out. I think that's the positive. My kind of negative scenario, I think, would be something not totally different than the North Korea situation, in that we made an agreement with them in '94, which was basically a similar type. It was basically, you're basically paying them to cap the program. And with the North Koreans, it was when the incentives or the economics, they weren't getting as much money, they sort of pulled back. And you can already hear those types of murmurings from the supreme leader that we're not getting what we thought. It seems like he's setting himself up to have a position where they think this deal isn't working, they didn't get what they wanted, they could blame it on us. And if he wants to stay with it, I think he's set himself up in a pretty good position that in 10 years, if he's not around, whoever follows him could have basically a latent nuclear weapons capability, will have these ballistic missile systems that they're developing, and have fortified nuclear sites, and the ability to reimpose these sanctions, I think, is very difficult, even if the Iranians aren't getting all that they wanted. Anyways, I think I'll end it here and take questions. Thank you.
One question. You wrote in your book about, let's say, the Freedom House lost the project on human rights.
Rights. Oh, thank you. The Freedom House Lhasa Project on Human Rights, and checking out so many projects that have been approved and scrapped by the State Department in all these years. Do you think the State Department has publicized this to the other part, that making Mr. Zarif happy that, oh, we have cut off human rights from the talks and from the negotiations, so we are more approachable, or not?
Well, I mean, that's interesting because a lot of these, when the Obama administration came in 2009, they started to kind of scrap a lot of these human rights funding of. There was one organization at Yale that was funding basically a documentation of human rights abuses in Iran. There was other program I remember for like training journalists, and they would say we're not rolling it back, but they would also at the same time say, they weren't effective. These were kind of Bush administration thing. They were kind of antagonizing people and not having much impact. But I look back at it now, I think it was kind of all part of this broader effort to engage the regime, the Nowruz speech, the letters to Khamenei, the kind of pulling back on some of these programs that certainly the Iranians thought was part of trying to instigate some a revolution, and none of them really came back. I think it was definitely human rights. You don't hear much talk at all about the human rights issue at all from Americans or the Europeans much, despite what's been a pretty bad crackdown over the year. I mean, you've heard the concerns about the Americans who have been kidnapped or hostage, in prison, however you want to talk about it. I do think that was a calculated decision very early on. That to me was one of the most interesting parts of the book, was like you kind of knew some of this stuff was happening, but when I really went back and looked at how Obama's 2008 campaign, it really was, Iran was so front and center in his kind of greater philosophy that he was going to be able to negotiate and engage with adversaries, whether it was, they sent people to Damascus very early on. The Cuba situation obviously happened, Burma. The North Korean thing kind of went off the rails, but it was definitely a huge part of his philosophy, and the Iran policy, more than any I can think of, certainly internationally, except for maybe pulling out of Iraq, was just front and center from the campaign all the way forward.
Thank you. Edward Joseph, Institute of Current World Affairs. Jay, congratulations on a very important book. I wanted to ask you about the Obama administration's perception of their Iranian negotiating counterparts. You mentioned that on the red line of bombing Assad over chemical weapons, that the impression might have been that if we bomb this proxy of Iran, that'll end the negotiations. And I'm wondering, was there any thought to the opposite of that? That if we don't follow through on this, the signal to Iran is, look, these guys are too scared to bomb Assad. They'll never go after us.
Right.
And same with the negotiations. The president and President Obama and Secretary Kerry repeatedly, publicly, vociferously made clear that there was really no alternative to these negotiations. Same question. Was there no awareness of the impact on their Iranian counterparts of this, that the Iranians would say, look, Obama's desperate. Kerry is desperate for a deal. We're in the catbird seat here. We can exploit this in the negotiations. I'd like to get your views on that. Thank you.
No, I think that's a good question, because I know a lot of the reporters who were covering, whether it was the red line issue or some of the other steps that the administration was taking, in the one sense, not really being supportive of the Green Movement at all, and then publicly coming out and calling for Mubarak to step down. It was a strange flip-flop where you're pressing an ally to get out when basically one of your most hostile enemies, you're basically giving a free pass. I really think the administration had it really ingrained, and I was told by officials in reporting the book that we are not going to have another Middle East war. This was so front and center in their thinking, and in a lot of ways, I think they were spooked about the Israelis. I think I've had officials say in late 2011 there was this famous Israeli kind of military exercise where they did a long-range mission where most analysts thought, okay, I think most people in the Pentagon thought the only reason you're doing this would have been for a strike on either the Iraq reactor or the Natanz facility. And you saw a real push by the administration to send Tom Donilon and others over to the Israelis to try to talk them down. And was it a fake? Was it just the Israelis trying to sort of goose the administration to do more? I'm not sure. I'm still skeptical that either the U.S. or the Israelis were close to strike. In fact, one of the things I find most interesting, if you look at the U.S.-Iran conflict since 1979, is just the U.S. has been pretty restrained. If you can, you have the hostage crisis in '79. There was this failed operation by Carter, but it was a pretty small operation. You had a few. The tanker wars in the late 80s where you had the U.S. hitting some Iranian naval vessels and the takedown of the Iran airplane. But, from the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon to the Khobar Towers attack to the rat lines that U.S. defense officials could see in Iraq of IEDs technologies coming in from Iran to support the militias, that there has been a real resistance to attack Iran because of just how destabilizing it can potentially be. And, there's frustration. You talk to, people who follow kind of the rise of militant Islam and, the failure to retaliate after the 83 bombing is seen as kind of a strategic mistake. And what happened in Iraq possibly emboldened Iran. But I think the administration, back to your question, really kind of got them into this position where we're not going to have another war. We're not going to press these guys. And I think they knew that. And I think that's why you saw how the Iranians took a situation where the cards did not seem stacked in their favor and came out with an agreement that was pretty good for them.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And my question is about when you say U.S. didn't want to have another war in Middle East, do you mean just Obama administration or Republican as well? Because U.S. mean both major parties. And I'm asking you this question because apparently there was an ego war between Bibi Netanyahu and Obama. Bibi wanted America to hit Iran, not just hit, but hit hard. And it's apparently Obama was determined not to do so. And I just talked with some Republican friend, one of them is here, and she told me it's waste of American dollars. I don't care about American dollar because I don't pay a lot of tax anyway, but I'm concerned as a, American about American blood. So how can you avoid these Middle Eastern conflict without taking Israel out of the equation? Can we make independent US foreign policy about Middle East that could not be influenced by Israel or by, when we can just seek American interest? I'm asking this because at the beginning of your presentation, you said that US interest in Afghanistan was very much alliance with Iran, not with Pakistan or not with Sunni states, because all those Sunni states and Pakistan was supporting Taliban, whereas Iran was the only Muslim country that was supporting American alliance, Northern Alliance. But Israel doesn't care, apparently, about those American interests. Israel care about its own interest. So again, my question is, can US formulate any Middle Eastern policy or any aspect of Middle Eastern foreign policy without getting Israel or people like core people like Bibi Netanyahu in the formulation?
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, back to the Republican question. I was explaining earlier, I do think the Bush administration was extremely reluctant to get into a conflict with Iran. It was really 2006, around that time, I think, when you saw a lot of intelligence coming out of Iraq about just how involved the Iranians were in arming Shiite militias, basically moving these IED technologies into these militias, which were taking out more U.S. soldiers than pretty much anything else in Iraq. So And there was, some pressure in the Pentagon to retaliate, maybe not hitting Iran itself, but to more aggressively target Iranian operatives in the country, and that happened to some extent. But I do think it's not just a Democratic reluctance. There's been a Republican one, and I mentioned the Reagan administration after '83. On the Israel question, I think one of the complicated parts of this issue is Israel. But when you looked at the kind of the U.S., amongst the U.S. allies, the skepticism or the opposition to engaging Iran, it was hardly just the Israelis. The Saudis, the Emiratis, a lot of these Sunni states, particularly on the Persian Gulf, were, they were not happy about these negotiations either. They were very skeptical, and they still are. So I think it's a little simplistic to say everything was driven by what the Israelis were thinking. I think they were definitely a factor, but I think if you look amongst U.S. allies in the region, a lot of the Sunni states felt that these talks basically happened behind their back, and they did. The first year, 2 years of these talks happened behind all of these countries' backs, and they felt, betrayed, I think, to some extent. I've talked to some who described negotiations that the U.S. had in Northeast Asia with the North Koreans, and the talks always involved the Japanese and the South Koreans as kind of because these were the countries that were on the front, and how can these talks be happening without the countries in the region playing some role, and they felt cut out. So I don't think it was just the Israeli question. I think it was broader than that.
And one of the millennials that was on the trip, there were about 10 of us, and asked the question, they said, maybe we can go to Iran next, because they really did not interpret Cuba as a terrorist nation. And they think that the situation with Iran is a lot more stable than what they've been portrayed it to be by our government. And I said, I really think it's a lot different in Iran towards America than it is in Cuba, because Cuba is welcoming us with open arms. Have you thought about what the ramifications are going to be when a lot of Americans travel to Cuba and they see that this country was never really a terrorist nation, and how that is going to affect the Iran policy? Thank you.
Well, I went to Iran a number of times for this book, and it is true, there is this huge kind of gap between the leadership and the people of Iran. Every time I've been there, the first 24 hours, you're sort of extremely scared. And then the next 2 days, you're meeting some guy whose cousins all live in Los Angeles. And it's very what was I worried about? So you kind of have that, there is, it's incredible when you think of all the countries that have a bad relationship with the United States. The fact that Iran has such a connection to this country, you go to Los Angeles, there are a million of them. There's this incredible connection, and yet there's this incredible gap. But, one of the, I think, more kind of, some people have thought of this Iran deal as potentially like China, the opening to China. My dad actually worked on that, and he's thought about it. But I think what's been disturbing in the year is that they've basically been targeting Iranian Americans and arresting them, which is basically seen as a kind of a shot across a bow that, that the group that you would think in a lot of these cases, whether it was Chinese Americans going into China as we normalized, as businesses started to go in there. I'm sure in Cuba there are a lot of Cuban Americans trying to go back. The part of the U.S. community that you think would be going in the most is basically being targeted not to go in there. So because there is such a concern that the public is pro engagement, I think the last few months of the Obama administration, I know there is kind of this hope that this policy could culminate maybe with Obama meeting President Rouhani at the UN next month, or possibly Secretary Kerry visiting Tehran in the end. And you just do not hear much optimism about any of that. Rouhani's running for re-election, and any handshake with Obama is seen as being poison for him back home. And that dynamic is not great, but I do think what you're describing, that is kind of the Obama administration hope. You have this huge population that's young, that is pro-Western in a lot of ways. You open up the economy somewhat. They're engaging, and you're going to have kind of what you're talking about in Cuba, and that could happen. But at this stage, it's just the regime controls so much of the economy. Like any money, I talked to one Iranian and British businessman there, and he this might be inflated, but he thinks only like 20% of the companies that you could do business with in some sort of big way in Iran are controlled by the Revolutionary Guard, which technically is illegal. So there's all this complaints about there's not a whole lot of money going in there, and there's still these restrictions. But I think if you're an investor there and you see who you'd have to do business with, it's not as black and white as just complaining that the U.S. is not kind of letting money flow in there. I think it's much more complicated than that.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that during the 2013 Red Line discussions that the IRGC would have scuttled the talks because they saw any U.S. strike on the Assad regime as a existential threat. Does that calculation still hold?
Is what that?
Does the IRGC's calculation that a U.S. strike on the Assad regime would be an existential threat hold?
One of the other kind of disturbing trends I thought that were emerging last year during the negotiations, that there were just all these high-level talks in Vienna and other parts of Europe between Kerry and Secretary Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, and there was this kind of building hope or belief that, okay, if we can solve this nuclear issue with this international coalition, then we can move on to Syria, that Syria will be, like, we can use this as a model to solve the Syria crisis. And, it didn't sound like a crazy idea, but, like, we kind of now know, and some of the stuff we didn't know at the time, but as these talks were going on, the Supreme Leader was sending his advisors and generals to the Kremlin, to Moscow, to sort of plot out a defense of Bashar al-Assad on a much more bigger scale than the Iranians had already been. So the Iranians have been, prior to the Russian invasion, by far the biggest life support line to the Assad regime. But it was just a few weeks after the deal was completed in Vienna that we found out that the head of the IRGC's international arm, the Quds Force, Major General Qasem Soleimani, had been in Moscow. And then it was, 2 months later, where you had this joint military operation start, where the Russians were providing the airstrikes and the Iranians were mobilizing both their own forces, Hezbollah, Shiite militias from across the region. So I think the amount of the stepped up operations, even a few weeks ago, there was, the Russians announced that they were doing airstrikes out of Iran. It didn't take very long, but Iranians are so nationalistic. And their relationship with the Russians is not historically is not a good one. The fact that they'd let Russian airstrikes come out of their borders showed just how, the defense of Assad is the amount of money and people they've lost in defense of Assad it's a massive thing. So you could see why. Even the White House swears there was no pullback relations to Iran, but you followed it over the past 2 years, it's find it impossible not to see a connection.
John Pereira, School for Defense Analysis. Regarding the harassment of U.S. Navy vessels in the Gulf. Thank you. Regarding the harassment of U.S. Navy vessels in the Gulf, do you think it's either A, that they're trying to provoke us into a response because the hardliners, this is what they want, or B, they're just pushing because they know how far they can go without, and they're just harassing and they're just blustering, trying to send a message?
I mean, my sense, and I haven't kind of done a forensic analysis of the last 2 to 3 weeks where there have been all these examples of it, but it feels like to me that the Iranians are kind of setting a line going into the next administration, kind of, fortifying. They're doing things that seem so kind of almost rubbing the U.S.'s face in it, arresting someone involved in the nuclear negotiations, because there was talk for years about these S-300 missiles being deployed. I never actually really knew how they were going to use them. The fact that they announced this week that they're basically going to be used to protect this Fordo nuclear facility. I mean, the facility is kind of it was enriching uranium, and it's not now. But in 10 years, it can. And the idea that they're sending this message that we're fortifying this facility so you can't hit it. I mean, those are pretty provocative, statements when a year ago people had this hope of some sort of big rapprochement. To me, it's signaling at the end of the Obama administration, and they know there's not going to be a John. I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, but they don't. There's probably not going to be a John Kerry who's that committed to this engagement. I mean, it's amazing how much Kerry talks to Zarif. It's at times 2 to 3 times a day on some of this stuff, and it's good in a lot of ways, but it's hard. We'll see what happens under the Clinton administration if she wins. If a Trump administration, I think we're pretty sure it won't continue like that, but I think it's signaling going into the next political cycle here. Right there.
Thank you, Jay, for a great presentation and a great book. Look forward to reading it. Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. My question is this. Given the mechanics of the deal as it currently exists, and given the elections coming up in the United States in November, elections coming up in Iran in June, and the resistance of the European banking community to work to make the deal work, what do you think the long-term prognosis is of this deal? Will it hold a year from now, 6 months from now? Thank you.
I mean, I did a kind of an excerpt of my book in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, which says why Khomeini thought he won. And I think for right now, I think he's the supreme leader, and despite the carping, I think they're generally probably, we've maintained our infrastructure. I think the numbers I cited in the book that, the oil exports were like almost 3 million before the deal, and they collapsed below 1 million, and now they're pretty high up there, and GDP growth is supposed to be 5% next year after like a pretty sharp contraction. So I think in the leader's mind right now, it's, if you were worried about a fiscal collapse or a balance of payments crisis a few years ago, which could potentially be a threat to the regime, you're not there anymore. And you probably don't want some huge cash flow when you're constantly talking about the threat of Western influence, the threat of Western businesses. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that one of the Iranian Americans arrested was kind of seen as the forefront of the business community. So for right now, I think it's probably going to hold from the Iranian side and probably from the U.S. side because there's kind of this equilibrium right now. But I do kind of worry down as this moves away from the Obama administration. Does the Iranian regime sort of say, okay, we've got our $150 billion back, we've got sanctions lifted to the point that it's going to be extremely hard to reimpose to the level they were. At that point, do they say, they didn't live up to the deal and then pull out? I think that is a risk. And I mean, the deal with the North Koreans survived 10 years, but it did not survive a change in administration very long. I mean, the agreed framework was 94. Bush took power in 2001. That deal was pretty much collapsed within a year, and they're still carping back and forth. The U.S. would say, they built an entire reactor in Syria. I mean, how could this continue? And the North Koreans said they would never live up. And I think you could see a similar type of, finger pointing in both directions, because it doesn't feel like there's going to be it feels very, very transactional. I mean, that's one of the parts of the U.S.-Iranian kind of engagement since '79. It's striking. It really has been, we had 52 hostages in Tehran. We had basically the agreement that got them out was unfreezing assets in the U.S. that the Shah had, and they got out. The Iran-Contra deal, the hikers who were taken in 2009, the Omanis passed cash to get them back, and then this recent deal to get the Americans out in January. We find out we were flying plane loads of cash into that country. So I think it's just so transactional. If it doesn't get any deeper than that there's always this risk that it's not going to last.
Mike Aguian, representing DoD. Quick question. Here in the U.S., obviously all politics is local. In Iran, the same kind of holds true. And one of the biggest reasons that Iranian voters kicked out Ahmadinejad was that you had declining economic situation. Currently under Rouhani, the economic situation for most Iranians is not really improving. If Iranians decide to kind of kick him out of power and they get more of a conservative, there's been talks of Ahmadinejad coming back and also conservatives coming back into power, and we have a more aggressive, Iran policy, Iran stance with Hillary Clinton or Trump. Do you see this peace deal kind of unraveling, or do you see it tentatively holding, giving sort of the international geopolitical sort of situation?
What's difficult is I still think, besides like the tenor of what Iran says, their policies have not, regional policies haven't really changed at all since the deal, at all. Their domestic policies really haven't, there hasn't been a kind of opening up under Rouhani. I mean, the presidential candidates from 2009 are still in jail. Ahmadinejad was like a train wreck for Iran because it just galvanized the international community against them, and it was the country's worst nightmare. What's interesting is there was this agreement in 2013, but there was this fuel swap agreement in 2009. It's not that different than the interim agreement. And that was Ahmadinejad who negotiated it. And then he got sabotaged back at home for internal political reasons. So that's one issue I still kind of don't have, like, were Rouhani and Zarif like real moderates who really want to change the situation and they're being clipped? Was it more of a good cop, bad cop situation where, these guys speak fluent English and are extremely charming, and so that the tenor changes even if the substance doesn't that much? I think that's what's still, I do think like Rouhani probably does want to engage economically and business-wise, and maybe he would normalize relations if he could, and that's not insignificant, but I still think those guys are pretty committed to the revolution. So it's how much would the policy really change if, there was a flood of cash and Rouhani could take this as like a huge victory? I don't know. I just don't think it's happening. The U.S. could be partly to blame, but I think the leader has been very tactical in doing things that he knew would deter people running back to that country to do business.
So, sorry, the follow-up would be that he ran on a platform during the election of being a more competent economic manager and linking negotiations with the U.S. and relieving sanctions to an improved economic situation. If the economic situation in Iran is not necessarily improving, he's likely going to get kicked out of office.
It has improved. You had almost a 1.5% contraction in, I think, 2013 to 5% growth next year. That's not fast enough for Iran for sure, but that's still I think it's different from having a potentially like a balance of payments crisis to stumbling along. But the Iranian economy is, even under Rouhani, you've talked to oil people, they were supposed to come up with all these great new kind of investment incentives to go into the energy industry, and it's not drawing a lot of people. There's interest, of course, but you haven't seen sort of any privatization, stuff like that. You just don't hear about that in Iran. So you wonder how far, even on the economic front, he really could go, even if it was a better like investment climate, like you described.
Tom Curry with CQ Roll Call. Despite whatever President Obama and Secretary Kerry say in public, do you think that they believe that in 8 or 10 or 12 years that Iran will have nuclear weapons, but that that's the world, the United States we can live with that, because after all, for all these years we have lived with the Soviet Union and China having nuclear weapons and sometimes antagonistic relations. What do they think? What do you think they think?
I think they kind of do believe like we've cut off their pathways to a bomb, you know, on a kind of a forensic level. Like they were doing these tests, you know, of actually making a bomb, and they stopped, and our intelligence is saying they're not going to do that, or haven't been doing that in about a decade. And, you know, we have greater kind of IAEA monitoring. So I think on that level, they probably think, okay, we've put something in place. But I think on another level, they're like, wow, these guys in 10, 12 years could have 100,000 centrifuges producing weapons-grade uranium in a country that vast, where they've always, I mean, since the program was basically discovered, that they're almost cheating at every stage of it. And the ability to really monitor that, I think, is very difficult. I really believe I think they think we're going to avoid a crisis. Things will moderate. The leader has cancer. He's 77. In 10 years, there'll be a much different Iran. So yeah, maybe they'll have a latent capability at that time, but it's going to be a very different country. Like, and therefore, you're not going to be as concerned, and they'll, you know, maybe at that point they won't want to have these massive plans that I think they announced a couple weeks ago they were going to build 10 new reactors. I mean, I don't know how they're going to pay for all this stuff, or the Russians, I assume, will be involved, but I think that's the bet, that they will have a latent capability in 10 years, but do the politics and the country change to the point that you're just not as worried about it? Well, let me get someone new. Okay, last one.
Andrew Schwartz set you up to talk about the 400 million and what it really meant and where's it going. And supposedly it's the biggest story of the year except for the election. So could you expand on this a little bit and deconstruct what you think really happened and what it really means?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think we know a lot of what happened now, which was the Iranians basically, there was this 400 million chasing back to 79, and the Iranians basically were saying, you know, this is our money and you owe us interest. And the administration is admitting now what they didn't admit initially was that this was a sequenced exchange. You know, these Americans sitting in Tehran were not allowed to leave until the cash, this 400 million in cash sitting in Geneva, the Iranians could not pick it up until the Americans were basically wheels up. I still think, though, there are some big questions that the administration refuses to answer, and if it comes out, and I assume it will, I think it's going to be a hard story to squelch. I mean, one question I still ask, like, who picked up that money in Iran? I mean, in Geneva. I mean, if you know the Iranian system, it's hard to believe that anyone else besides the Revolutionary Guard could have picked up that money. Handing $400 million over to the IRGC is, I mean, that's a very different story than, we had a deal with the Iranian government to pay back this debt. You know, maybe it was paid into some escrow account. I think, you know, did that money immediately go to Hezbollah? Did that money immediately go to the Assad regime? I think those types of questions are going to keep being hit, and the administration does not want to answer them. And I think that's why this story is not going away, because they just won't answer those questions. Anyways, one more.
Given the amount of Russian involvement in Iran the past few years, especially culminating recently with them how do you think they're going to influence U.S.-Iran relations in the near future, and do you think they're planning for a post-Khamenei world?
I mean, the Russian-Iranian relationship is interesting, because I'm no sort of historian, but historically the Russian and the Persian empires were not very friendly. But it does seem that, like, they want to sort of create, they've talked about joint cooperation in Iraq, they've talked about, you know, what they're doing in Syria, and the Russians really seem to be kind of focused on, as we've pulled back to sort of woo countries that are traditional allies, whether it's, you know, Turkey, or they've set up a joint military operation in Jordan, which is pretty amazing considering how close the Jordanians are. I think it's going to be, I think Putin and Khomeini see themselves as allied against the U.S., and I know there's this hope, you hear it amongst American and European officials, that, well, the Iranian and the Russian interests diverge in Syria in some ways. The Russians really, they don't have this huge military operation into Lebanon to fight the Israelis. They have a pretty good relationship with the Israelis, so maybe we can there'll be less wedded to Assad in the longer term, and we can sort of peel them away. But I mean, they've been saying that now for 4 or 5 years, and I just haven't. If anything, this cooperation is intensifying. It's accelerating. So maybe it's a short-term dynamic, but I haven't seen anything that it's kind of backs this hope that these guys are about ready to cut off from each other. Anyways, thanks a lot. Thanks for coming. Enjoy the book.